Hello.
Hi.
I'm gonna wait just a few more minutes to see if anybody joins us, and then we'll get started.
Okay.
So we're going to be working in our trail guide today, and we're going to wait another 2 or 3 minutes. I usually try to wait until about 5 after, and then we'll get started with our lecture. So a couple of the things that you are going to need for this lecture are your handouts, the diagrams that were in MindTap. There's two separate ones. There are the ones in the workbook packet, and then there are the individual diagrams. And the individual diagrams are the ones that are to go into the clear sleeve so you can practice writing and erasing because they're on the test, so they're separate. Just this morning, I uploaded a PDF that is bony landmarks for us to review because we haven't really gone into bony landmarks. And then of course your trail guide, highlighter, and anything you need to take some notes this afternoon. So before we get started, welcome. This is for level B, cohort B, and we are jumping into the trail guide arm and shoulder. So typically arm and shoulder is the first of the bones, bony landmarks, and muscles that we dive into. And I'm not sure if you went over bony landmarks at all in skeletal. A lot of times we table that until we actually jump in to the trail guide. So if you could just type really quickly in the chat window and let me know whether or not you did the basics of what a bony landmark is. We're still going to review that, but at least that'll let me know how much more in depth to go. So if you could let me know in a little chat screen whether or not you you've gone over that already. Okay, great. So we'll just do a quick little review of that then, is what we'll do. I just want to get back into my normal view and close this chat screen, and it's not letting me do that. All right, we're back again. All right, so since you've already gone over it, I'm just going to do this part a little bit more quickly. The handout is there. If you don't have it from MindTap, then you can just kind of go along with me. Basically, a bony landmark, when you first start, we kind of just teach you those are areas to avoid. And then, of course, once you jump into the skeletal system and then now into the muscles and the bones, you find out that bony landmarks are typically attachment points for muscles. And now they may not be some place that we avoid anymore, but a place that we need to know a little bit more about the origin and insertion of the muscle, and kind of helps give us an idea of what movements happen if we know that origin and that insertion and where that bony landmark is. So bony landmarks are an area on a bone to which something attaches, sometimes another bone, a muscle, maybe blood vessels or nerves. We have them divided, especially on this handout, into categories. We have the holes and depressions. And one of the first ones on the list is a facet. And especially when you get into face, torso, spine, there's a lot of facets where each bone come together. A facet is a flat, smooth surface used as part of a joint. So facets are usually found where two bones articulate together. And that smooth surface usually is a space where another bone can kind of glide into that space. A fissure is a groove intermediate to two bones. A fossa is a depression in a bone, and I can tell you that fossas are often named after the bone, after the muscle that lies in them. And when we get into the scapula today, you will find that in the fossas of the scapula, they are named after the muscles. A foramen is a hole in a bone. A meatus is a canal or tube within a bone, and we have, like, for example, our external auditory meatus, which is like a little hole or canal. We have sinus, which is a hollow cavity, which is our sinuses that fall primarily in the nasal cavity sinuses, but we have other sinuses as well. A notch, which is a small carved out portion of the bone. I don't know if we have to, we'll learn our jugular notch today. So kind of a little curved out place, a lot of times where an artery, a blood vessel, or nerve or something goes or fits through that notch. Then we have a ramus, which is a smooth, flat area not used for articulation. Then we get into our projections, and we have a process, and especially on the vertebrae of the spine, we have all those spinous and transverse processes. And on your landmark sheet, it says an often sharp, almost finger-like projection. It says my internet is unstable, so if you can't hear me, let me know with a little chat message. But if not, I'm going to continue on. It says a process often sharp. You can hear me? Okay, thanks. Often sharp, almost finger-like projection away from the main part of the bone. And the spinous process is a good example. We have our mastoid process on the skull, where you can actually pick up the bone, the temporal bone, by that process. A lot of times you can pick it up with your hands. The head, which is a rounded structure, usually on the proximal epiphysis of the bone. Good example, the head of the femur, ball and socket head, the head of the humerus we'll learn about this week. We have also a notch, which we went over in holes and depressions, an indentation in a bone, often curved. Condyle is a large rounded bump used to form a joint with another bone. So we have, especially when we get to the medial, the distal part of the humerus and the proximal side of the ulna, you'll find those condyles where those two bones come together. An epicondyle, remember epi means above if we go back to our medical terminology. So epi is, I always say it's the bump above the bump. If the condyle is a bump, the epicondyle is the bump above the bump. So it's a bump above the condyle. And then we have the trochlea, which is a pulley-shaped structure. Something that is not on this list is we have, it's a process like coracoid and coronoid processes we're going to learn about today. Coracoid and coronoid both mean beak-like shape. So they are a process, right? If they are a finger-like projection. So coracoid or coronoid means beak-like. So it's a beak-like projection. They both mean the same thing, more or less. So how you remember if it's a coracoid versus a coronoid, there's some little tricks that I have there, but just remember they're both a type of process. We have ridges as well. We have a line. The lines are sometimes harder to see or to determine, and they're a very small, faint ridge. So they're not as large as a crest or a spine or a ridge would be. Sometimes we call them ridge, like we'll call this occipital ridge or occipital groove right around here. They're not really a crest or a spine or anything like that. Lines are usually posterior. Crests, conspicuous ridge on a bone, often on the anterior surface. We have the iliac crest, right? And you'll learn about that when you get into hip, thigh, leg. Then we have a spine, which is a very prominent, long and sharpened ridge along a bone. And we'll learn about the spine of the scapula today. And sometimes they're simply called a ridge. Then we have bumps, which we won't confuse with the condyle, because the condyle is where it articulates with another bone, right? So bumps, a tubercle is a small bump. And then a tuberosity is a medium bump, and it's usually also a roughened spot. Sometimes it can almost be a little bit longer. And one of my students one time told me they remember a tuberosity is bigger than a tubercle. They call it a tubercity. It's like a city, and a city is bigger. So we have our tubercle or small bump, our tuberosity is the medium bump, and the trochanter is the really large bump, and we only have the trochanter found on our femur. We have the lesser and greater trochanter on the femur bone. And then we have some lesser used terms, the fovea, which is a small dimple-like depressed area, hamulus, which is a hook-shaped projection. I can only think of the hamulus being on the hamate in the hand. I don't think we have the hook of the hamate is the hamulus. I don't know if we have another one. I guess I'll have to Google it or research it later on. And then we have a fontanelle, which is a space between cranial bones of an infant. We call it the soft spot. So that's kind of our review of the bony landmarks. In case you haven't gone over it before, I uploaded this PDF this morning. So it is there for you to print out and have as a reference, because as you start to learn these bones and bony landmarks and the attachments for the muscles, it really helps for you, just like the medical terminology where you're building blocks of everything that we've been learning since week 2. The bony landmarks are really important as well, because it'll help you identify certain things just by the name. And then when you're looking at the skeleton or you're looking at the diagrams in your book as well. And the same thing, if you haven't gone back and reviewed your medical terminology in a while, I recommend going back to that or making notes, because when it comes to the names of the muscles, 9 times out of 10, they're going to give you a little cheat in the name. They're going to tell you where they're located, what they look like, or where they attach. A good example is when we get to a muscle that says capitis. Capitis means head. You put a ball cap on your head. You know, if it says capitis, you're looking for a muscle that comes up somewhere into the head, right? Or cervicis, cervical neck. Cervicis is going to attach or originate or insert one or the other somewhere around cervical spine. So if you find yourself struggling with muscle names, try to go back to and relearn a lot of that terminology. Something else that we're going to review again really quickly is just going over some basics of the muscles. We know transverse means that they run up and down. Rectus means that they run up and down, right? Transverse, side to side. Oblique, at an angle. So that will help you as well if you're looking for an oblique muscle, that the fibers and the origin and insertion are at an angle, and they're at an angle so that when they pull that insertion towards it, a lot of times obliques are responsible for some sort of rotation. So what I want to do first, and I'm going to stand up to do this because it's hard for me to go over movements, is talk a little bit about movements and some of the basics that you should have learned in muscular system. Normally, I like to have everybody repeat it back to me. I do a little bit of Simon Says or something like that. But our rule of thumb is muscles on the front of the body do what? They flex, right? I'm going to erase this. So it's not a hard and fast rule, but it's the majority of the time. Front of body, flexion. Back of body, extension. We have some exceptions, right? Exceptions. Our knees and our toes are on backwards. And hopefully you guys can read that messy writing. So muscles on the front of the body, typically responsible for flexion. Muscles on the back of the body, extension. Knees and toes are on backwards. So opposite. If it is bending the knee, bringing the knee into flexion, it's on the back, right? And the same with the toes. They're on the underside, the plantar side of the foot. Also, we have abduction, abduction, and adduction. Abduction, think about your middle line, your medial space. Abduction, away from that middle line. Good way to remember that one is thinking about your arm as being abducted by aliens, right? Adduct, back towards center line. All right, so and we have some other movements too that we're going to go over. So you can stand up to do this, or you can do it sitting, but we're going to flip over just very quickly to page 63 of your trail guide, because I want us to get in the habit, whether it's online or in class, of learning and remembering these movements. And when you start to learn the origin insertion, that will help you as well. So flexion, we're starting out with the shoulder. So it's remembering to break it down. Scapula, different than shoulder, shoulder different than elbow, wrist, and fingers. So muscles on the front flex. Flexion of the shoulder means it's coming this way, right? Towards the front. So any muscles that cross this shoulder joint are going to be responsible for flexion of the shoulder. Extension of the shoulder, coming back towards the back of the body, right? So flexion coming forward, extension going back. We learned abduction and adduction. We also have horizontal abduction and adduction. So same thing, middle line. If I'm coming this way, back closer to the middle line, that is horizontal adduction. If I'm going away from middle line, horizontal abduction. Adduction, abduction in the shoulder. If you flip the page, excuse me, I'm gonna need a little drink. Then you have your regular abduction and adduction. Abduction, my arm is being abducted by aliens. Adduction, coming back down towards center line. These are all movements of the shoulder. We also have rotations. So we did this. This was horizontal abduction, adduction. Now bring your arm in close and rotate. So now the ball is rotating in the socket. That's different than this. So I like to think of like the robot, right? So in this position, we have lateral, which means away from the inside, right? Rotation, medial rotation, lateral rotation, medial rotation. So these are our movements of the shoulder. We'll get into the movements of the elbow and the wrist further on. Scapula, I want to come to next, and you can stand up to do this. You won't really be able to see my scapula very well in my black shirt, but I'll turn around. So elevation and depression. Now we're talking about the scapula coming up and down. It's elevating and it's depressing. Elevation and depression, moving into the scapula area. We elevate and we depress. We also have abduction and adduction. It looks a little different for the scapula in the way that the scapula moves. The easiest way I can tell you to think of that is adduction. Draw those shoulder blades together. The medial side of the scapula is coming closer together in adduction. Like a boxer would punch, abduction, AB away. The medial edge of the scapula is coming further away. So we're talking about those two bones coming closer to middle line. So it could be one at a time. So coming back, that medial border of the scapula is coming closer to middle line. So adduction of scapula, abduction, punching away. So think of a boxer, or in the book, the diagram, I like to think of when somebody's laying on their back and they're doing like a press, right? When they come down, those scapulas are adducting, and when they extend out or they cross over, they are abducting away. We also have upward and downward rotation of the scapula, and that's a little bit different. We're actually bringing it in and curving it and then rotating it down, kind of up and around. And that one's a lot easier to see once we're able to actually palpate and work on one another. So those are our movements that I want to go over with as we first get started today. And then we'll go into the movements of the forearm, elbow, wrist, etc. when we get into that section on Thursday afternoon. So flexion of the shoulder, if you want to do it with me, coming up. Extension of the shoulder, coming back towards the back of the body, posterior, right? Flexion, extension. Abduction of the shoulder, away. Adduction down. And normally in a live class, I have my students do a little yoga with me. Abduction, adduction. Horizontal, adduction. Horizontal, abduction. Lateral and medial rotation, medial to lateral of the shoulder. Elevation, depression, adduction, and rotation. All right. Any questions about the movements of the shoulder and scapula? Something that we'll review when we come back in again on Thursday. I want us to do then is, now that we've gone over the movements, I want you to come into page 46. And 46, I always like at the very front of the section when it shows you regions as flesh and bone. And I'm going to come into my screen share. I'm going to jump in and out of screen share quite a bit with you guys here. All right, so we're at this view. And in this view, you can see what is in your book. And he's got kind of that flesh and bone look, because we're not going to have the benefit of looking at our clients just as bones and muscles like we do in our book. So this gives us an idea of where everything's located. You can see how the trapezius is in that upper shoulder area. You can see the clavicle coming down and around. We're going to learn about the acromion. This gives you an idea of where the acromion is going to be located. The pecs, the deltoid, biceps brachii. And then you look at that anterior lateral view. You can see where triceps brachii fall. You can see the shape of the deltoid, kind of looking at anterior middle fibers. We'll learn more about that. The axilla, or the axillary region of the armpit, where latissimus dorsi and serratus anterior would fall. And then finally in that posterior view, where the superior nuchal line of the occiput, where the trapezius upper fibers come up towards the neck. Spine of the scapula, which you can feel when you palpate. You can probably feel that on yourself. Inferior angle of the scapula. Triceps brachii again, latissimus dorsi, the spinous process running down the middle of the spine, and then the spinous process of the thoracic vertebra in that view. So we're going to jump over to page 48. And on page 48, I actually want you to have out your diagram, page 28 of your student workbook, and we're going to fill that in. So you can use page 48 that looks similar to the slide I'm sharing now. And I'm going to move this around so that I can see my other views. I have more than just this one. Let me flatten this out. This guy right here. All right, so now you should just be seeing my screen share, I believe, at this moment. So this is the first diagram that I want us to go over. And if you look in your page 48 of your trail guide, that'll help you fill this in. And the first thing in number 1 is that is the sternoclavicular joint. We also call it the SC joint. You can see as I have it written in. And what I want you to notice, especially looking in your book, is that that SC joint is named where the sternum and the clavicle articulate together. It's where they meet, right? So it is the sternoclavicular joint where the sternum and clavicle come together. And then number 2 is the clavicle. And then number 3, we have the acromioclavicular joint. So we have a bony landmark coming up off of our scapula called the acromion. And that acromion is where the clavicle meets. So it is the acromioclavicular joint where the acromion process and the clavicle come together, also known as the AC joint. And then we have the glenoid cavity where it joins, sometimes called the glenoid fossa, where it joins the humerus. So we call that the glenohumeral joint. So they're named after the cavities, where the two bones articulate with one another. And of course we have the scapula and we have the humerus in that picture as well. Any questions so far? Two more people have joined. All right, so I just want to make sure and see if there are any questions so far. No questions. Okay, great. All right, so going back into our diagrams then, we are moving down to just the scapula itself here. We are starting to dissect that just a little bit more with those bones and bony landmarks here. And you can find your scapula on page 49. And there you can see number 7 is that acromion that we were talking about for that acromioclavicular joint. That clavicle actually comes out and articulates with that acromion. Then we have superior notch. And typically a notch, as we said, is where sometimes a muscle, sometimes a nerve, or artery or something is passing through that notch where it doesn't get impinged by the muscles or by the bone. Number 9, we have the coracoid process. Remember, beak-like. And the way I remember coracoid from coronoid on this one is coracoid scapula. I remember that hard C on the scapula. Coracoid process on the scapula. And then you see number 10, we have the superior angle. And then number 11, supraglenoid tubercle. So we talked about the glenohumeral joint. So here you can see where that humerus is coming into what's known as the glenoid cavity or the glenoid fossa. So supra above that glenoid cavity, supraglenoid tubercle, we learned is a small bump, right? And we have an above, then we have our below infraglenoid tubercle. So they lie above and below the glenoid cavity or fossa. Then we come down and we have our subscapular fossa. We are looking at the anterior view. So if you were looking at your client through their chest, you are looking at the side of the scapula facing the anterior or front of the body. And we learned that fossas are typically named after the muscles that lie in them. So where the subscapular fossa is where we will find out when we get into the muscles that our subscapularis muscle lies. We have the lateral border. So this is the side towards the outside of our body. Our medial border, the side closest to our spine, the two borders that are coming together towards the spine when we talk about adduction, adduction of the scapula, and then we have our inferior angle. So I'm going to stop the share for a minute, and we're going to look at our book, page 48. We're going to highlight as we go along. So the shoulder complex is made up of three bones, the clavicle, scapula, and humerus. The clavicle, or collarbone as we often call it, is superficial and runs horizontally along the top of the chest at the base of the neck. It articulates with that acromion we talked about, as well as with the sternum. The sternoclavicular joint is the single attachment site between the upper appendicular and axial skeletons. So if you remember, you learned in the skeletal system, the axial skeleton is our spine, right? Our vertebrae, the ribs, the sternum, etc. So our appendicular skeleton are our appendages, our arms and legs. So for our entire arm, the only place that it attaches to our axial skeleton is at that sternoclavicular joint. We'll learn as we go further in that scapula is actually what's called a floating joint. It does not attach to the skeleton via ligaments or anything there. It is all supported and stays in place because it has 16 different muscles that attach to it. For movement, for stabilization, etc. So the sternoclavicular joint is the single attachment site between the upper appendicular and axial skeletons. And I'd like you to go ahead and highlight that in your trail guide. The scapula is triangular shaped bone of the upper back along with the clavicle. It plays a vital role in stabilization and movement of the arm. It has several fossa we learned about, corners and ridges that serve as attachment sites for 16 muscles. I want you to highlight 16 muscles. It glides across the posterior surface of the thorax to form the scapulothoracic joint, scapula and thorax, right? However, because this articulation does not have any of the usual joint components, it is considered a false joint. I want you to highlight false joint that we just talked about. And please stop me at any time if you have questions. The humerus is the bone of the arm, and we say it is the bone of the arm because in anatomical, this is the arm, this is the forearm. So it is the bone of the arm. The proximal humerus, remember proximal further up towards the axial skeleton. The proximal humerus articulates with the glenoid fossa of the scapula to form the glenohumeral joint that we talked about. And it's a synovial ball and socket joint, which gives it the widest range of motion. Remember that ball and socket is what allows me to whirl it all around in different directions and give it free movement in every which way. And that synovial capsule is what lubricates it and allows it to give that range of motion without too much friction happening on in there. And then if you look at your diagram, you can just see that covers everything that we just did on that first diagram of our workbook. And then there's just something really, really interesting, and that is a lot of people don't know what a furcula is. And a furcula is actually the clavicle for a bird. And if you look at the bottom of page 48 in that box, a bird's clavicle is actually joined into one piece instead of two separate pieces like we have, because they have to be able to flap their wings. They need more stability. So the furcula is actually the clavicle like we have, but it's one fused piece that gives them stability to flap their wings, and that is the wishbone that we break. It's the clavicles fused together on the bird. That's what the furcula is. So not really a highlight, but something good to maybe make note of in case it pops up in massage prep or MBLEX, right? And then you look over at the diagrams on page 49, and we kind of just went over one of the scapula diagrams, and we're gonna In a second, go to the next one on page 49. As you can see, the first one that we just did at the top of the page, the medial border, sometimes called the vertebral border, if you want to write that little note in there because it's closest to the spine. And sometimes the lateral border is called the axillary border because that lateral border is closest to the axillary region or our armpit. So worth making a note on your diagrams there. I'm going to look at page 49 now, and I'm going to go back into screen share with our next diagram. All right. So we're going to go down to the bottom first of this diagram so we can look at our posterior view of the scapula. So same thing, we have a superior angle. And what I want you to notice before anything else, before we start to label everything, is you can now really clearly see number 12, the spine of the scapula. And that is a place, if you reach your hand around onto your back, that we can feel when we're palpating, when you first started massage school and those first hands-on days, we had you just avoid the whole scapular region because of that spine. But you're going to be learning as we go through arm and shoulder that the scapula actually has that supraspinatus and that infraspinatus that we really kind of want to massage. As we start to learn that anatomy of the scapula, we'll find that there are areas in there. So if you reach around and you feel the spine of the scapula coming out and around, just superior to that is a muscle, and then the whole inferior part of it in that fossa down there is the infraspinatus. These are rotator cuff muscles that we really need to gently, because they're very, the bone is very superficial there, but those supraspinatus and infraspinatus need love too. When we're massaging, we need to make sure we work those areas as well. So as we come in and label, then we have our superior angle, supraspinatus, above the spine. So we just learned that number 12 is our spine of the scapula. So there our name tells us what we're looking for. Supra, above, spinatus, the spine, fossa. That nice indent, as we learned a fossa is, when we learned our bony landmarks, a depression in a bone, often named after the structure that fits in there. As we come around, we see, sorry, I want to flip my page. We see the acromion. We're looking at it posteriorly now. The acromion that comes around towards the front. And actually, if you bring your hand onto the clavicle and you slide your fingers out to where the acromion articulates with that clavicle, you can kind of feel where it indents in, and it can be quite tender when you do that. And if you come just inferiorly to that, you can actually find that coracoid process, which can be very painful to press on as well. That's just down below, just medially and inferiorly to the acromion. We have the acromial angle as it comes out and starts to become the spine of the scapula. And actually it's not on here, but a lot of times we call that space where we see the acromion and it comes around to the acromial angle and it starts to come down into the spine of the scapula, where it disappears into that medial side of the scapula. We sometimes call that the root of the spine. You can always write that down if you like to, root of the spine. And then we learned supra above, infra below, so below the spine, infraspinous fossa, number 13. And then we have our lateral border, our medial border, and our inferior angle. And just stop me if you have any questions as we go in. All right, so we're gonna jump over now to page 50 in our trail guide. And we are looking there at the picture of the humerus, and we also have some pictures of the clavicle there as well. So I'm going to scroll back up to the proximal view of our humerus, which means the top, up to where it articulates with the glenoid fossa, where it articulates with the scapula. And you will see that we have the greater tubercle in number 1. Now we're looking at the anterior view. Greater tubercle, bring your arm in to anatomic position, which means the palms facing forward. That greater tubercle is on the outside, and if you bring your hand out there, you can feel that greater tubercle can be quite tender. And then we have the lesser tubercle, which you can see in anterior view. We're coming in then to the medial side, right? Towards that head where it comes into that glenoid fossa. So we went from lateral where the greater tubercle was. We came in more medial to the lesser tubercle. And in between those tubercles, those two bumps, we have the intertubercular groove. I call it the bicipital groove. And that groove is there because there's actually a muscle, we'll find out later, that comes up through there to attach onto our scapula, onto our coracoid process. And it kind of goes through there to stabilize the humerus for us. So the intertubercular groove, that's a misspelled tubercular groove, lies right in between the lesser and greater. So just remember, the greater is more lateral. We can actually see the greater in posterior view, but we cannot see the lesser tubercle in posterior view. And we come down to the deltoid tuberosity. And again, tuberosity bigger than a tubercle. And next time you're in class, find skinny and find the tuberosity, deltoid tuberosity on skinny. You'll see it's a bigger bump, and it also is more textured. It has a roughened spot that allows more attachment and more movement of the muscle that's there, gives it a stronger attachment site. When we jump into the posterior view, we have the head of the humerus. And then we can see that greater tubercle still out there laterally, I apologize, in that posterior view. And then we come down and we can see on the lateral side, when we're in anatomic position, that deltoid tuberosity. So the one thing I can mention, I'm going to stop share for a minute, that some of my students make a mistake with when they're trying to identify the bones in the arm is remembering anatomic position, standing forward, palms facing forward. And I know you can't see my entire arm, but imagine it was down to my side. Is the biggest mistake I see is students in anatomic position. If you want to look at posterior, you have to do this. You have to flip around. You cannot flip your arms. You cannot just switch like this, because my lateral has just become medial when I do that. And that'll mess you up on labeling all of your medial and lateral condyles, epicondyles, helping you identify the greater from the lesser tubercle. So remember, when you're identifying, I had one student kind of lifting their arm up like this, and I'm like, well, you just messed up your proximal to distal if you start thinking of it that way. Anatomic position, if you want to think of posterior, you got to flip the whole body over supine to prone in order to see or to think of the medial and lateral sides. If you start flipping the arm, you're going to mess yourself up. Number 7, our deltoid tuberosity. So we're just looking at that deltoid tuberosity now out there on that lateral side. So that was our diagrams, page 28 and 29 of our workbook. We're going to jump to, I want to go out of order. I don't like to lay in the muscles until we learn the landmarks, right? So I want to jump to page 54, not on your book, but in your workbook. the actual diagrams that you have, we're jumping to page 54 in the workbook. We're only on page 50 in the trail guide. We're looking at the full length view, and I'll go ahead and forward us to it. We're looking at this full length view of the humerus. So it is page, you can see at the bottom, it says it's page 54 of your workbook. It's page 50 of your trail guide. So now we're just looking at the humerus here as a whole. And you can see number one is your greater tubercle. Again, we're looking at that anterior view, just like when we saw the proximal view of it. The head of the humerus, which is where the glenohumeral joint comes together. We have our lesser tubercle again, and then in between, and it's just showing it a little bit lower than it did on the other diagram, but you can see then that that intertubercular groove or bicipital groove, because we're talking about the one of the heads of the bicep muscle goes up into that bicipital groove, also called the intertubercular groove. And on your test, it'll be called intertubercular groove. We come down on the humerus to that deltoid tuberosity. And now we're getting into the condyle and the epicondyle here. And we're learning the condylar ridge and the epicondyle, and not so much the actual condyles below it where it articulates with the ulna. So number three, we have the lateral supracondylar ridge. So supra above, condyle. And we learned our condyle is our large rounded bump, right? So supracondylar ridge. And then we have the lateral epicondyle. So that is the bump above the bump, right? And so the condyle would be the bump below that. And we jump over to the medial side, same thing. Medial supracondylar ridge and medial epicondyle. So the bump above the bump. And we have the ridge above the bump above the bump, right? So think of your hand in anatomic position. That medial side is on the inside of the elbow. That lateral side, you can come out to the outside part of your elbow and kind of feel where that condyle and epicondyle would be, especially if you bring your elbow into bent position. And then we're going to look at the posterior, tomato view. And again, in the posterior view, we can see the head of the humerus, the greater tubercle. We have that deltoid tuberosity again. And then we have the medial supracondylar ridge and the medial epicondyle, the lateral supracondylar ridge, and we've added something new in here. We have the olecranon fossa. So what I want you to do is bend your elbow and bring your hand down to this bony part of your elbow right here. Your olecranon is right here. So the olecranon fossa is what allows, when we straighten, where that bone goes away and lies into that olecranon fossa. Some of my students that didn't know how to pronounce it called it the olecranon. And when you hit your elbow, you hit your funny bone. It's kind of right, that nerve runs right kind of through here. So they would say ole whenever, we always knew in class when somebody hit their funny bone, they'd say ole. I don't know if that will help you remember the name olecranon. So we have the olecranon fossa, where we will learn when we get down into the radial and the radius in the ulna, we'll learn more about the actual olecranon itself. So we have that olecranon fossa. And then below that, we have the lateral epicondyle. Let's see. I think somebody just gave a message. We do. We have a new message. Nope, no new messages. All right. Any questions so far? Send me a little message. Let me know of what we've done. We're good so far? Yeah? All right. So if you look in your book at page 50, where we had the bones we just labeled, and you can kind of see the sternal and acromial ends of the clavicle. And I just also like to always show how trail guides work. And actually, let me backtrack a little, because when we're in class live, arm and shoulder is usually our first leap into the trail guide. Did you get a little overview of how your trail guide works? All good, okay. Did you get any kind of overview on how your trail guide is broken down at all? Or is this your first time really jumping in? Okay, I'm gonna backtrack just a tiny bit for you then. Some notes that I like to make in my trail guide, this will help you out, is somewhere on that inside page, just inside the cover, if you want to backtrack a little, I like to write down, and you can choose to do it in red or blue if you want to. I like to write red is the origin or anchor, because this book coordinates with skinny in class. If you're at Fort Myers, I'm assuming you probably have the same skeleton in class. So you'll look at the skeleton, you're going to see red and blue dots all over the skeleton. I don't know if you've ever noticed that before. When you see the red and blue dots, you'll notice that the red dots represent the origin, which is the anchor, and the blue is the insertion. And I like to write that in here, so when I'm looking at a muscle on the skeleton, I can know where the origin is, because our other rule of thumb is that we learned in muscular system, the origin most of the time pulls the insertion towards it. There are some exceptions, like extension of the head with certain muscles, etc. So that's something that I always like to write into my trail guide. And then if you go over onto page 2, where it says how to use this book. Sorry, I'm backtracking on you guys. I should have done this in the beginning. In that second paragraph, you will see, when possible, a region's bony landmarks have been strung together to form a trail. These trails are designed to help you understand the connections between structures. And you'll look at that picture, it says A and it has an arrow to B, and then it goes up and then down to D and E. And that kind of gives you an idea when you're palpating a bone or a muscle, because when you're on the outside of the spine coming around that acromial angle, that's a lot easier to palpate than where it disappears into the root of the spine. So it kind of tries to give you a good starting point to palpate and then move in as it maybe goes a little bit more deep. It's more superficial in that start point. So that's always something good to look at. On page 4, there's some palpation hints. If you don't know what palpation means, it means to examine or explore by touch. So when we have our palpation evaluations, that's what we're doing. We're exploring the bones, the landmarks, etc. So I always kind of like to have you go through that. When you come over to page 6, it talks a little bit about how you palpate. When you come back in school, it's going to be a little bit harder because you'll actually have to palpate on yourself while we're still socially distancing. So when you want to feel the fibers of the muscle, you'll see at the top of page 6, you roll or strum across the muscle in order to feel the direction that the fibers run. But when you want to actually feel the muscle engaged, contract and relax, then your hand becomes still. So for example, if you were to want to do flexion of the shoulder, your hand would become still because anterior deltoids are going to be partially responsible for that. And you come into the movement, that's when you feel the muscles contract. So that hand becomes still, that's doing the palpation. So those are just some little tips for how to palpate there. If you come over to page 11, it kind of goes over agonist, synergist, your primary movers, your fixators and things like that. It's just a little review of what you did in muscular system. Same with page 12, it kind of revisits triangular, pinnate, bipinnate, multipinnate, muscles. Goes through the body planes again when you get to page 21. And then it's really useful when you get to page 23. It goes over all the movements of the body. So you don't really need to go there right now, but it's a quick reference. I tend to write these as kind of a, up front where you wrote red and blue, I tend to write like my own little table of contents of some of those things that I want to jump to. But you'll see all the movements of the body, abduction, adduction of the leg, and flexion of the fingers. It goes through the entire body instead of where it's broken down by sections in the rest of the book, depending on what part of the body we're doing. So that's always a little guide to look at and take you through. Page 34 reminds you of the joints if you ever need to review that again. And then the other thing is when you're palpating and you're looking at the book, we go back to where we were on page 51. You'll notice that actually you'll see the trail guide we talked about, A, B, C, D, and E, how to follow the bones. The same when you look at the diagram below where it's bringing you down to find the deltoid tuberosity. Those trails is why it's called the trail guide, help you find and navigate those bones so you don't just get lost trying to find everything. But if you look at page 52, you'll notice you have a little icon that has the finger and then the check mark. And those are telling you how to palpate and how to double check that you found them properly. So that's the little overview of the trail guide. And we're gonna jump back into the trail guide again and to our diagrams, because we're going to now come into the muscles. So those were the bones and bony landmarks of the arm and the shoulder. So now we're going to jump into those muscles. If you come to page 61, you're going to notice that 61 matches your diagram that is page 30 of the test diagrams. And the reason we're going over these diagrams like we are is these are actually going to be on your test in addition to the questions and answers, the highlights that I give you in the book, the regular multiple choice. There are, I think, 7 diagrams, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 diagrams that will be in your test as well. So now we're going into the muscles of the arm and shoulder on page 61. And so I'm going to share that one. And I just want to catch up here where we are. So we're looking at this diagram. And then we're looking at this diagram right here. So this is what you want to be filling in to practice for your test. Number 1, you're going to see the trapezius muscle, and particularly the upper fibers we're looking at, and the arrow is pointing to the upper fibers. And I want you just to pay attention to the direction of those fibers when you look at them, right? The direction of the fiber is going to give you an idea of what happens. You could imagine that some extension, some elevation and depression is going to happen depending on the direction that the fibers run. Number 2, we're looking at the deltoid. 3, we're looking at levator scapula. Levator, imagine what that does. That helps with elevation of the scapula. Number 4, rhomboid minor, and the minor always comes above the major. So below rhomboid minor, we have rhomboid major. And then we learned about the supraspinous fossa. So lying right in that supraspinous fossa is number 6, the supraspinatus. So again, the name gives you a hint as to what it is. And below that, the infraspinatus. And then we have teres minor and teres major, the minor above the major. And number 10, we have triceps. 11, we're coming into the erector spinae group, and you'll learn more about those when you get into face, torso, spine. And then we have 11, we have our serratus, and I like to remember the serratus because that edge looks kind of like a serrated knife, that zigzag edge, and that is serratus posterior inferior. We have the latissimus dorsi muscle coming out and around, and then we have the thoracolumbar aponeurosis. In muscular system, we learned an aponeurosis is a form of a tendon. It's a broad, flat, tendinous sheath. So we know anytime we see aponeurosis, it means it's a tendon. And it is in the thoracolumbar region. So it's in between the thorax and the lumbar. Thoracolumbar aponeurosis. And then we're gonna flip on over to page 62 in our trail guide, which is 31 in our workbook. All right, so we're doing that lateral view now, and we will get further into the individual muscles in just a little while. We're looking at that levator scapula now. We have a cutaway, the trapeze, just deep to the trapezius is superficial. Kind of see where it's coming up from below the trapezius, and you'll see those upper fibers of the trapezius muscles. You can clearly see that delta shape or triangle shape of the deltoid muscles. We have our infraspinatus, our teres minor and teres major, and our latissimus dorsi coming around. And then we have our bicep, our brachialis, and our tricep. So the interesting thing is on the upper arm, we only have 3, or what we call the arm, we only have 4 muscles that we worry about that are for the arm. 3 on the front, our bicep brachialis and our coracobrachialis, which we'll learn in the bottom diagram, and only 1 on the back, which is the extension, which is the tricep. In this view, we also have the serratus anterior and our external oblique. And now we're looking at that anterior view where we can see the levator scapula a little more clearly, whereas before we were looking at a posterior and lateral view. We have pec minor. And I always remember pec minor, pec major, you know, comes across this whole area. Pec minor, it looks like 3 bathing suit straps coming up into that bathing suit region and actually coming towards that coracoid process that comes up here. So I like to remember pectoralis minor looks like the bathing suit straps coming up towards the shoulders here. And then you will see the coracobrachialis. Sometimes it's called the armpit muscle. If you bring your arm out to the side, it's this muscle right coming across the armpit towards that same coracoid process. When we look at the other side, number 13, we can see those upper trap fibers again. We can see the deltoid, specifically the anterior and middle fibers. We have pectoralis major, serratus anterior, you can see that serrated edge again, and we're looking at bi, meaning 2. We're looking at the 2 heads of the biceps brachialis muscle. All right, any questions with that? where we are there. Are we good? So we're going to jump into our book then, and we're going to actually learn a little bit more about these muscles. So if you turn to page 63, it's my favorite section in each part, each muscular group within the book, and that is where it shows us the movements for the muscles that we are learning. We are learning arm, shoulder at this point. So you get to see all of the muscles that do flexion. So I want you to highlight flexion, and I want you to highlight the anterior fibers of the deltoid, pectoralis major upper fibers, biceps brachii, and coracobrachialis. All of those muscles do the flexion movement of the shoulder. And then under extension, I want you to highlight that group as well. Deltoid, the posterior fibers, latissimus dorsi, teres major, pectoralis major, the lower fibers, and triceps brachii are going to do that extension. Under horizontal, abduction, abduction, deltoid posterior fibers, and this is where I want you to highlight or make note. So the posterior fibers are going to do horizontal abduction. The anterior fibers are going to do adduction, as well as the pectoralis. So the deltoid is an antagonist to itself. What that means is, because we break the deltoid down into three parts, anterior, middle, and deltoid, in adduction, the posterior is an antagonist for the anterior fibers of the deltoid. In horizontal abduction, the movement, the primary mover, the agonist is those posterior, and the anterior muscles are the antagonists. They're responsible for the opposite action. So there are muscles in the body that are antagonists to themselves. So you can make a little note or just highlight that it says antagonist on abduction and antagonist on adduction. We come over to page 64. The muscles that do abduction are the deltoid, all fibers, and supraspinatus. I want you to highlight all fibers of the deltoid and supraspinatus are doing the abduction. And adduction, back towards middle line, latissimus dorsi and teres major. We'll learn a little bit more about those two muscles right there. You learned about the Batman and the Robin and the muscular system, and the teres major is the Robin, is the helper to the latissimus dorsi in that adduction. For lateral rotation, I want you to highlight infraspinatus and teres minor. It's good to know all of them, deltoid fibers as well, but specifically I want you to highlight the infraspinatus and the teres minor. Medial rotation, coming towards the middle line, I want you to highlight latissimus dorsi, teres major, subscapularis, and pectoralis major. Elevation, I want you to highlight and put an asterisk because this is something I know that you really need to know. Traps elevate and depress the scapula, different fibers. So on elevation, upper fibers of trapezius unilaterally. So they can go individually, right? They elevate the scapula. So do rhomboid major, rhomboid minor, and levator scapula. And then trapezius lower fibers do the depression. So highlight trapezius for depression, and I want you to highlight all the muscles on elevation. Over on page 66, adduction of the scapula, that's bringing those medial borders towards the spine. I want you to highlight both rhomboid major and minor. For adduction or retraction and abduction, I want you to highlight serratus anterior with the origin fixed. All right, so let's jump into those individual muscles now. We have some territory to cover before 4 o'clock. Normally my lectures end up with plenty of time. So the deltoid is that triangular shaped muscle we talked about, located on the cap of the shoulder. The origin of the deltoid is identical to the insertion of the trapezius, which is very interesting. And it comes down to that deltoid tuberosity, and that forms that V shape. In that second paragraph, I want you to highlight the deltoid fibers can be divided into 3 segments: anterior, middle, and posterior. So we have anterior, middle, posterior. We learned a little bit about that when we were learning that they are an antagonist to themselves when it comes to horizontal abduction and adduction. So under actions, I want you to make sure you highlight adduct the shoulder, all fibers, anterior fibers flex the shoulder, and posterior fibers extend the shoulder. Those are highlights. Its origin is the lateral 1/3 of the clavicle. So we're out here. Here's our medial. Here's our lateral third. The acromion, which is where the clavicle and humerus, clavicle and scapula come together. Sorry, my brain went away. And the spine of the scapula. So it rotates around. It doesn't rotate. It wraps around and comes down and forms that triangular shape. Its insertion is the deltoid tuberosity. Make sure you highlight origin and insertion. And when do we use our deltoids? Virtually all movements that involve the shoulder: slipping your arms into a jacket, raking, shoveling, sawing, or rowing a dinghy. All right, and we are flipping over to trapezius, page 68. And if you want to write a little note in here, you can. They are the most superficial muscle. Traps are most superficial muscle. It's also one of the thinnest muscles. So the trapezius lies superficially along the upper back and neck. Its broad, thin fibers blanket the shoulders, attaching to the occiput, the bone at the base of the head, lateral clavicle, scapula, and spinous processes of the thoracic vertebra. I want you to highlight the trapezius fibers can be divided into 3 groups: the upper, which is descending fibers, middle fibers, and the lower ascending fibers. You can see they ascend up, whereas the upper ones descend down. The upper and lower fibers, this is also a highlight, are antagonists in elevation and depression of the scapula, respectively. So upper and lower fibers are antagonists to themselves. So the trap is an antagonist to itself for upper and lower, but not the middle fibers. So on page 69, the upper fibers, I want you to highlight. Extend the head and neck. Make sure you know that highlight. It's a special highlight. Also want you to highlight unilaterally, which means one side at a time. They help elevate the scapula, which is that shrug, right? Its insertion is the lateral 1/3 of clavicle, acromion, and spine of scapula. I want you to highlight that as well. Its origin, external occipital protuberance, medial portion of the nuchal line of the occiput, ligamentum nuchae, and spinous processes. Make sure that you highlight the insertion of the trapezius. Are we good so far? I'm going to keep moving right on. Over to page 71, latissimus dorsi and teres major. My favorite muscles. So highlight the latissimus dorsi is the broadest muscle of the back. Stop highlighting. Its thin superficial fibers originate at low back and ascend up the side of the trunk and merge into a thick bundle of the axilla, armpit area, right? Both ends of the latissimus dorsi are difficult to isolate. However, its middle portion next to the lateral border of the scapula is easy to grasp. That's this broad part out here. When you look at bodybuilders, it almost looks like the poof of a cobra head coming out. When you see the cobra kind of widens its neck out, and you see those bodybuilders come up and that latissimus dorsi wraps out. So what I want you to highlight again and put a little asterisk next to this is the teres major is called Lat's little helper. I like to write major little helper instead of just little helper because a lot of times people will think it's the teres minor because of the word little helper. The teres major is called the Lat's major little helper. It is a complete synergist with the latissimus dorsi. So the latissimus dorsi and teres major together. It is the Robin to the Batman that teres major is. It's located along the scapula's lateral border between the latissimus dorsi and teres minor. Although they share names, the teres major and teres minor rotate the arm in opposite directions. The major medially, the minor laterally. Highlight: the latissimus dorsi and teres major are sometimes called the handcuff muscles since their actions collectively bring the arms into a resting position behind the back into handcuff position, which is also helping with adduction, a deduction of the scapula, right? So I want you to highlight latissimus dorsi actions, all three. Extend the shoulder, adduct the shoulder, bringing it back down in, right? And medially rotate the shoulder. Medially, it's pulling it in and around. And the reason it medially rotates is because it inserts, remember that intertubercular groove, that bicipital groove we talked about? It inserts in there. So if it's coming from here, it's coming in underneath into that groove. When it contracts, it's pulling and rotating it in. It doesn't wrap around the outside or it would laterally rotate. Comes up through into that groove. So when it contracts, it's pulling that groove around into medial rotation. Want to make sure you know all three of those actions of the lats and its insertion as well. Teres major, I want you to highlight all three of the actions as well and knows those. Extend the shoulder, adduct the shoulder, medially rotate the shoulder. Since it's a full synergist to the lat, if you can remember the lat, you will remember teres minor. Teres major. Any questions? Are we good so far? When do we use our lats and teres major? Steering a kayak with a paddle, unzipping the back of your dress, walking with crutches, and climbing up a rope when storming a castle. And if I had $1 for every time I stormed a castle, I would have no money. All right, so we're jumping over to page 74, the rotator cuff muscles. And I want you to write down an acronym for that to help you remember those rotator cuff. We call them the sits muscles, S-I-T-S. I don't know if you can see that behind me. S is in Sam, I is in I, T is in Tom, S is in Sam. And that is because it is the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, not major, right? Minor, and the subscapularis. So sits, S-I-T-S, 4 rotator cuff muscles. So highlight supraspinatus, infraspinatus, teres minor, and subscapularis. And I want you to highlight are known as rotator cuff muscles. Together, they encompass and therefore stabilize the glenohumeral joint. Highlight that as well. So we're going to get into those individual muscles now on page 75, supraspinatus. abducts the shoulder, highlight that. And I want you to know its origin. It's supraspinous fossa of the scapula. Supraspinatus is in the supraspinous fossa of the scapula. That's its origin. Its insertion is the greater tubercle of the humerus, right? So it's coming out here. Greater tubercle of the humerus. Infraspinatus, action I want you to highlight, laterally rotates the shoulder. Its origin, infraspinous fossa of the scapula. And its insertion is greater tubercle of the humerus. So think about that. It comes out from that fossa to that greater tubercle. So if it contracts, it has to laterally rotate because it's pulling that insertion of that greater tubercle around and back. So it laterally rotates. It also adducts because it's going to pull back down in the arm, right? So supraspinatus, abduct, infraspinatus, adduct. Its origin, infraspinous fossa scapula. Insertion, same as supraspinatus, is that greater tubercle of the humerus. Teres minor laterally rotates the shoulder. I want you to highlight that. And I also want you to highlight it adducts the shoulder. I want you to know both of those movements or actions. Its insertion as well, highlight, is also the greater tubercle of the humerus. And then the subscapularis medially rotates the shoulder and it stabilizes the head of the humerus. All of them are stabilizers. So I want you to know that it medially rotates, that its origin is the subscapular fossa of the scapula, and its insertion is the lesser tubercle. So let's talk about why it medially rotates. It's on that anterior side of the scapula, and it's coming to the lesser tubercle. So if one of the muscles is coming around to the greater tubercle, when it contracts, it's rotating my shoulder out. This one comes into that lesser tubercle further in. So when it contracts, it pulls that lesser tubercle towards it and it medially rotates the shoulder. The other thing that I want you to notice is that they are called rotator cuff muscles, but the supraspinatus does not rotate. It is the only of the 4 rotator cuff muscles that does not do rotation. It abducts, abducts. So that's worth noting as well, that it is the one of the 4 rotator cuff muscles that actually does no rotation. Are we good? We know our highlights and what we need to know. When do we use our rotator cuff muscles? Conducting an orchestra, installing ceiling tiles overhead, starting a pull cord on a lawnmower, fanning smoke-filled room, reaching your hand around to scratch your back, clutching the trail guide to your body or your chest while you're praying that you pass your test. We'll all pass it. I'm just joking. All right. And I do have a highlight under palpation on the bottom of page 76. You'll see the little check mark. And I want you to highlight that you can differentiate between the fibers of the trapezius and the deeper supraspinatus. Highlight with the arm alongside the body, have your partner alternate between abduction and adduction, slightly relaxing the shoulder. So that's how we would palpate supraspinatus, and I want you to highlight that. Put a little asterisk next to it, which means it's a super important highlight. Any questions? All right, we're jumping over to page 82 of the rhomboid major and minor. So the rhomboid muscles are located between the scapula and the vertebral column, and you can look at the diagrams and see. So we can have an idea that those are going to be important in like elevation and depression, but also in abduction, right? So rhomboid minor and major, They have thin fibers that lie deep to the trapezius and superficial to the erector spinae muscles. I want you to highlight and know the actions. They adduct, adduct the scapula towards in, and they elevate the scapula. So elevation and then adduction, the medial edge of that scapula coming closer to the spine. They originate on the spinous processes in various places between cervical and thoracic. I want you to know the insertion. The major inserts on the medial border of the scapula between the spine and inferior angle, and the minor is in the upper portion of the medial border. So minor comes above the major. And when do we use our rhomboids? Sticking out our chests, shrugging our shoulders when we're uncertain, and squeezing through the entrance of a small cave. All right. Any questions? Are we good? I know there's just two of us, so hopefully we're good. Stop me if you need to. We are jumping over to page 84, which is the levator scapula. It's one of my favorite muscles. I have a lot of pain in my levator scapula. So I want you to highlight unilaterally, uni meaning one, which means we can do either side. Levator scapula, elevate the scapula. Put an asterisk next to that highlight. Make sure you know it. I also want you to highlight they laterally flex the head and neck when they're unilateral, right? They also downwardly rotate the scapula bilaterally, both at the same time. Extension, muscles in the back extend, right? So bilaterally, they are extending the head back. I want you to know the origin, put a little asterisk in a highlight. Transverse processes of the first through fourth cervical vertebrae. Its insertion is in the medial border of the scapula between superior angle and superior portion of the spine of the scapula. And we use our levator when we're rotating our head when changing lanes in traffic, holding a phone between our ear and our shoulder, lying on your sides, snuggling your head into your pillow. I tend to sleep like this. I have a lot of problems with my levator, my sternocleidomastoid muscles as well. All right, we're going to move over to page 86 in our trail guide and look at our serratus anterior. And again, you'll see that that edge looks almost like a serrated knife. That's what helps me remember and identify that I'm looking at one of the serratus muscles. You can see all of those origins on the ribs, right? So always well developed on superheroes, the serratus anterior lies along the posterior and lateral rib cage. Highlight that. Stop highlighting. Its oblique fibers extend from the ribs underneath the scapula and attach to its medial border. This muscle is unique in its ability to abduct the scapula, making it an antagonist to the rhomboids. And that is the bottom of that paragraph. I'd like you to highlight that. So remember, the rhomboids are on that medial border of the scapula coming into the vertebrae of the spine. And this is also on the medial border, but it's coming out to those ribs. So you see it originates on those 9 ribs, and we know the origin pulls the insertion towards it most of the time. So that means abduct the scapula. It's pulling it away from middle line because it's pulling that medial edge of the scapula where it inserts towards its origin. So highlight abduct the scapula. Put a little underline underneath it if you need to. It also upwardly rotates the scapula and depresses the scapula. You can see the directions that the fibers are running, kind of slightly at a downward angle, especially when you're looking at those lower ribs. And it also holds the medial border of the scapula against the rib cage. So if you look in that diagram, it comes from the ribs up underneath that scapula, and it attaches to that medial side. So it comes under and attaches to that medial side. So it pulls it out in abduction, but it also is what's keeping it there. Remember, it's a floating joint. It holds it to the rib cage. Origin, external surface of the upper 8 or 9 ribs, and know the insertion, interior surface of the medial border of the scapula. We're coming over to a pectoralis major on page 89. And I think what I'm gonna do, if I don't have anything to write on the board, even though we're in the book, I wanna go ahead and screen share rather than you just watching me speak. I think that's more exciting to not watch me speak, to see what we have on the screen here. Trapezius, rhomboid major, levator, serratus. There we go. That's a little more exciting for you, I think. All right, pectoralis major. Looking in your book on page 89, I want you to highlight the pectoralis major is a broad, powerful muscle located on the chest. Stop highlighting. Except for the part beneath the breast tissue, its convergent superficial fibers are accessible. I want you to highlight pectoralis major is divided into 3 segments: the clavicular, sternal, and costal fibers. And you can see from the picture the costal fibers, sternal fibers, and clavicular. And of course, the names give us a hint. It's going into, it originates, I'm sorry, at the clavicle, at the sternum, or at where the costal cartilage is. That's a special highlight. Put a little asterisk next to it if you need to. The upper and lower fibers perform opposing actions of the shoulder joint, making this muscle an antagonist to itself. Highlight for me the actions. All fibers adduct the shoulder. They also medially rotate. See how they come out and around onto that greater tubercle of the humerus? So when that muscle shortens or contracts, it's rotating that greater tubercle around medially. The upper fibers flex the shoulder and the lower fibers extend the shoulder. That's where you get the antagonist on itself. It originates in the medial half of clavicle, sternum, and cartilage of the 1st through 6 ribs. That's why it's called the costal, because we know costal is cartilage. I mean, chondral is cartilage. I'm sorry, the costals are the ribs. They insert into the greater tubercle of the humerus. Any questions, or are we doing good? I think we're doing good. I haven't seen any questions pop up. All right, we are jumping over to pectoralis major, page 92. Did I just say major? Pectoralis minor, page 92. Highlighting the pectoralis minor lies next to the rib cage, deep to the pectoralis major. Stop highlighting. Its fibers run perpendicular to the pectoralis major fibers from the scapula's coracoid process to the upper ribs. You can see that angle. So one I said is like 3 bathing suit straps coming up. Highlight during aerobic activity, the pectoralis minor helps to elevate the rib cage for inhalation. So as you inhale, it helps pull those ribs up, allowing more space for the lungs to inflate. The major vessels serving the arm, which are the brachial plexus, axillary artery, and vein, cross underneath the pectoralis minor, creating the potential for neurovascular compression by this muscle. And if you want to write out to the side, TOS, thoracic outlet syndrome. So a lot of times pectoralis minor, as well as the upper trap fibers, levator fibers, can impinge the brachial plexus or the axillary artery and vein, and that can cause thoracic outlet syndrome, what is that numbness or tingling down the arm, and specifically in the first 3 fingers, thumb, pointer, and middle finger. I want you to highlight that its actions depress the scapula because it is attached to that coracoid process. So even there on the front, remember that coracoid process comes from the back and comes in under the clavicle, and we can palpate it from the front, the anterior side of the body. So that's why it depresses the scapula, pulling it down. It also abducts the scapula because we're on that coracoid process, which is on the outside, lateral side of the scapula. It assists to elevate the thorax during forced inhalation, as we talked about. And I want you to highlight both its origin and its insertion. Third, fourth, and fifth ribs are the origin, and it inserts on the medial surface of coracoid process of the scapula. No attachment on the clavicle. A lot of people think it comes up to the clavicle. There is no attachment on the clavicle. We have three muscles that actually attach on that coracoid process. The pect minor that we're learning about, the short head of the bicep brachii, and the coracobrachialis. All right, so we have the subclavius. I don't have any highlights on the subclavius for you. And as a matter of fact, they don't even have it in our preview slides. As its name suggests, the subclavius is located underneath the clavicle, as you can see from that picture. It runs deep to the clavicle and pectoralis major and can be challenging to truly isolate. No highlights there. It depresses, elevates, and stabilizes the clavicle, so it assists in inhalation, etc. We're going to jump over to biceps brachii on page 95. Our biceps brachii, or our biceps as we commonly call them, we know our brachii from when we learned our body regions are that upper arm area. So that's why it is biceps brachii. I want you to highlight the biceps brachii lie superficially on the anterior arm. And I want you to write down next to that, but deep to deltoid at its origin. So it's superficial, but it runs deep to the deltoid at its origin at the coracoid process. So it's superficial, but runs deep to which muscle? Deltoid, where it originates. It has a long head and a short head which merge to form a long oval belly, and the tendon of the long head passes through the intertubercular groove of the humerus. That's why we sometimes call it the bicipital groove. And if you look in that picture, you can see it comes up on that long head and then attaches to supraglenoid tubercle, which is on the scapula. So it doesn't actually have an attachment anywhere on the humerus itself, but it does run through that groove. It crosses, if you'll notice, two joints, and we know if a muscle crosses a joint, it causes movement for that joint. Therefore, it helps with movement. It causes movement at the elbow and the shoulder. So I want you to highlight its actions. It flexes the elbow. We're going to learn about supination a little bit later, but highlight that it supinates the forearm. And then it also flexes the shoulder. So it crosses both the elbow and the shoulder joints. So it does movement at both. It originates at the coracoid process of the scapula. The short head does. The long head originates at the supraglenoid tubercle of the scapula. And that long head runs through that bicipital groove, and they come down and they insert at the tuberosity of the radius and the aponeurosis of the biceps brachii. So you can see that there is the bicipital aponeurosis that extends off, and that's why it inserts into that aponeurosis or that tendon, because it's a broad tendinous sheath when it's an aponeurosis. So no attachments at the humerus if you'd like to make a little note of that. And on the diagram itself, you'll see at the bottom where it says bicipital aponeurosis. I want you to highlight that. And I want you to write next to it, extends off distal tendon of biceps brachii. The bicipital aponeurosis extends off the distal tendon of the biceps brachii. That's important to know. Put a little asterisk next to it. When do we use our biceps brachii? Holding a heavy hymnal while singing in church. With your right arm using a screwdriver to tighten a screw, carrying an infant in your arms in a cradled position. All right, so we are coming now into triceps brachii, the back of the arm, the posterior side, right? I want you to highlight the triceps brachii is the only muscle located on the posterior arm. Bring that up onto the screen for you. The only muscle located on the posterior arm. Creates an extension at the elbow and shoulder and is an antagonist at both these joints to the biceps brachii, right? Muscles on the front flex, muscles on the back extend. So since it's the only muscle on the back, it is an antagonist to the bicep brachii. Highlight the triceps has 3 heads. That's why we have the word tri. We have long, lateral, and medial. And you can see from the picture, the lateral, think of anatomic position again, palms facing forward, thumbs on the outside edge. We have the lateral head, we have the long head, and then we have the medial head, which kind of comes down to that olecranon process. I want you to highlight all heads extend the elbow because it crosses that elbow joint. The long head, highlight AD ducts the shoulder. So the lateral head stops at the humerus. It does not cross another joint, but that long head comes up to the scapula. So it's affecting it's affecting the elbow and the shoulder joint in that long head. So long head extends the shoulder and it adducts the shoulder. And it also, because of all heads, extends the elbow. I want you to highlight its insertion is that olecranon process of the ulna. The olecranon process of the ulna. And when do we use our triceps? Slamming the trunk of a car, pounding in large nails with a big old hammer, raising your body during the up phase of a push up, and dribbling a basketball. And the last muscle that we have of the arm is the coracobrachialis. We did biceps brachii, we did triceps brachii. Oh wait, we have also, I'm sorry. We should also have our, give me a second. Did I miss the brachialis? I think our brachialis, even though it's considered a muscle of the upper arm, I believe our brachialis is in the forearm section because it affects the elbow joint. I think it's divided in there, but I just want to verify that I didn't miss something. Yep, we're going to talk about the brachialis when we get into the forearm instead of the upper arm, even though it originates up there towards that deltoid tuber, just below that deltoid tuberosity. So we'll cover that on Thursday. So we are talking about our coracobrachialis now. What I said is also known as the armpit muscle. The coracobrachialis is a small tubular muscle located in the axilla highlight, sometimes known as the armpit muscle. It is a secondary flexor and adductor of the shoulder. Stop highlighting. An anatomical position, the coracobrachialis is deep to the pectoralis major and anterior deltoid, lies anterior to the axillary artery and brachial plexus, lies in front of the brachial plexus and the artery there. It abducting the shoulder, opening the axilla, brings the belly of the coracobrachialis into a superficial and palpable position. I want you to highlight the action. It flexes the shoulder. On the front, muscles on the front flex, except for our knees and toes are on backwards. It also adducts the shoulder. I want you to highlight its origin is the coracoid process of the scapula. Coracoid process of the scapula. It inserts on the medial surface of the mid-humeral shaft. And under palpation, I want you to highlight to locate the fibers of the pectoralis major, and that's how you will find the coracobrachialis. So if your partner is supine, you laterally rotate and abduct the shoulder to 45 degrees, as you can see in that picture. Down on the bottom, the arm is turned up at 45 degrees. Highlight, locate the fibers of the pectoralis major. You will work your way out laterally in order to find coracobrachialis. Put a little asterisk next to that highlight. It's an important one. And when do we use our coracobrachialis? Reaching around your face to scratch your opposite ear, weightlifting, doing a bench press, and in martial arts, a forearm block in front of your chest. All right, I am going to stop that share. That is all the highlights that we have for this section. We've gone through page 106. You also have assignments to go along with that, which is reading, reviewing these highlights. Work on your workbook through this front section of the shoulder and arm. When we get back together on Thursday, we will explore the forearm and the hand, and the rest of the diagrams we will go over as well for that part of the lecture. I think we've been at it almost 2 hours. Do you have any questions for me about what we've covered? Which highlights are important? Any of the actions that we did, like flexion, extension, abduction, or adduction? Or are we good? Good? No questions. All right. Well, hopefully it was clear enough. We're all learning kind of how to lecture online. I'm very much a visual learner. I'm used to having students in class doing the movements, doing Simon Says, getting up, doing some yoga for the actions and stuff like that. So I'm looking forward to seeing students back in school again this coming week. I will be lecturing this here at Clearwater campus online Thursday as well as live. So if you're back on campus, hopefully you'll have an opportunity to kind of do these movements and actions a little bit more in person. But other than that, I would say that's all that we have for today. If there's no questions, you're clear on the assignments that you have due. The other assignments should be opening up tomorrow evening for the second half of the workbook if they're not already open. Definitely the first half of the assignments for shoulder and arm should already be open. And if there aren't any other questions, then I'll say goodbye and I will see you again here on Thursday, and I'll see you soon. Bye.